Hi there. I'm Jan McCauley. I am from the SUNY COIL Center, so the Center for Collaborative Online International Learning, which is the name that SUNY uses for these types of virtual exchange courses that happen between two higher education classrooms. So I actually am going to, I'm going to take a little bit of a broader view. This is specifically, about EU and US funded initiatives, and the Stevens Initiative, which many of you have probably heard of through the Aspen Institute, was a grant that we had at the SUNY COIL Center for several years, and we built I can tell you a little bit about the project that we did and the analysis of that work that happened. But I kind of wanted to, in the interest of kind of looking at research around virtual exchange and COIL in a broader sense, I kind of pulled back from some of the details of the final report and things like that. I'd be happy to share the final reports of that project with you all if there's interest, but I'm kind of pulled back and wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about research and some of the limitations and struggles and things like that that come with researching around this type of work. So just as a little bit of background, though, as I mentioned, in March 2016, the COIL Center received a grant from the Stevens Initiative. The Stevens Initiative is an international private and public partnership that is designed specifically to increase exchange, people-to-people exchange, between youth in the US and the Middle East and North Africa region that Miriam mentioned is also involved in the Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange remit. So the Stevens Initiative projects are specifically US and MENA region kind of focused. So we at the SUNY COIL Center, we started a project specifically to increase COIL partnerships between State University of New York campuses and campuses in Lebanon, in Egypt, and in Morocco. So those were our three partner areas, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. I didn't go into a ton of background about the COIL Center and things like that, so just to kind of bring people up to speed who might not be familiar with the COIL Center, we sit at the system level administration at the State University of New York. So our access to professors and campuses is extremely broad, being that we're at the system administration level. The SUNY system has 64 campuses throughout the state of New York. So we have access to professors from community colleges to agricultural technical colleges, four-year comprehensives, and university R1 centers. So we have access to all of those kinds of people, and we work with the development of COIL projects at all of those levels of campuses. Not every single one of the 64 is in our network at the moment, but we work with all of the levels of those campuses in a variety of ways to create these partnerships between professors in the SUNY system and professors elsewhere, anywhere around the world. Obviously, for the Stevens Initiative project, it was specifically focused on those MENA region partners. But in our usual model, our global partner network is where our SUNY professors find their partners, and that network is open to any university around the world, including US-based institutions as well now. So just as a bit of background. I also wanted to mention that the final reports, you'll see some similarities. 2 years ago at this conference, our colleague Sarah Guth and I presented some of the feedback from the second cohort of our Stevens Initiative project. We did kind of a detailed analysis like Miriam did, kind of comparing another EU-funded project with the Stevens Initiative data that came out. So I wanted to, reference back to that and note that, we owe a great deal of information to Sarah Guth and Francesca Helm, who wrote that final report in the second cohort of Stevens Initiative. For the third cohort, we actually did a much smaller analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about why that was. So for our project, this was kind of what it looked like. These are the three cohorts of activity that took place as part of the grant that we had with the Stevens Initiative. So you can see we grew the cohorts with each iteration, kind of started out small to get things moving and create the partnerships once the grant had been achieved. all of that kind of stuff. So by the end, you can see in cohort 3, we had established 30 partnerships. So a professor on the SUNY side with a professor internationally, 15 separate courses. These covered a wide variety of disciplines, all manner of disciplines from, humanities and language learning and social sciences all the way through STEM fields, philosophy of education, all kinds of things. The COIL model is not discipline specific in any way, and we work pretty strongly with interdisciplinary matches. That's kind of our favorite thing, really, in this sense of the kind of integrated learning that we were discussing in the keynote earlier. This is, I think, where COIL can really shine in bringing two different content areas, two different geographical areas, two different cultural contexts to a project that students will collaborate on in real time. So what we did was the kind of mixed methods approach that is being used in the Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange was very much the case for our analysis and our data analysis in the Stevens Initiative project that we did. So we had, we took this approach specifically because it was relatively underutilized in the virtual exchange field at that time. So thinking back, the first report came out in 2017, 18 was when the Cohort 2 report came out. So most of the tools that are out there or were out there at that time for analyzing intercultural competency were really, and through exchange, were really geared toward mobility-based programs. That has changed over the last few years, and we're seeing a lot more development, which we'll talk about as well, for virtual exchange-based programs. But it required a different kind of take, really, for us to start to really dig in and see what kind of impacts these projects have. I should say also that the projects that happen through the COIL Center are typically anywhere from 6 to 10, 11 weeks in duration. That's the amount of time that the students spend actually in contact with one another through a variety of technological tools. Synchronous and asynchronous as allowed by the scheduling of the courses, the time zones, all of those kinds of things. Typically, asynchronous is much more common, obviously, especially with this kind of time zone difference in the Stevens Initiative project. So over that 6 to 10 weeks, the students, go through several phases of kind of icebreakers and getting to know each other, then engaging in specific project tasks related to the content of their courses in all of these cases, and then reflective kind of piece to wrap things all up or present the final product of their projects, right? So in this data collection, what was designed at the time were 3 kind of qualitative sets of prompts, okay? So in the Stevens Initiative, which is different from the Erasmus Plus projects, we did pre, mid, and post-COIL surveying, okay? So, and they were qualitative for the most part. There was some quantitative data that was collected as part of the initial survey, and then the rest of the prompts were very much qualitative. And these were the research questions that were broadly looking to be answered as a result of those. And I am not sharing all of the prompts because they're extensive, and this is also one of the stumbling blocks of this approach that I'll kind of get into a little bit more, is that there were a lot of prompts. They all required pretty deep reflection on the parts of the students, and if you think about, I'm sure all of you know your students pretty well, if you're thinking about them taking part in a pre, mid, and post survey related to an 8-week project, it's a heavy lift, and it's asking a lot of the students, and that's really where we struggled in a lot of ways. We got a lot of really great data, a lot of really great quotes. Those stories that Miriam was talking about from that qualitative reflection piece were excellent, but in the sense of creating a large data set, we struggled just because of, I think, the weight of what we were asking students to do. There were other, other things too, but we'll get to that. So, okay, so the Cohort 2 methodology really was looking to go deep, go broad. We were looking at multiple disciplines, obviously, all different kinds of contexts for these activities that were happening. They were really seeking to try and show change over time with the pre, mid, and post kind of surveying. Again, it's hard to think about, or it's one of the questions that we're always left with is, how much can we realistically expect a student to experience change over a short term, like a 6 to 10 week project? Obviously, it depends on where they start, which is another factor. So, how far along any sort of scale of intercultural knowledge they might, go across time is questionable. But we wanted to, and this you'll recognize the Luke analysis and the in vivo. Sarah Guth and Francesca Helm kind of developed this methodology for analyzing the themes through the interviews, as well as doing the kind of the quantitative content analysis piece. Did you want to add some?
Luke is something everybody can use, but you can also feed it with your own
coding. Yeah, so that was how this project happened, and how the Erasmus Plus projects are being done. There was manual coding of all of the qualitative reflections that were submitted by the students, and then those were analyzed through the Luke software. So very high level of time intensity as well, right? So, all right, so specifically related to the analysis of this Stevens Initiative data, these are some of the limitations. In the context of this conference, I can't overstress the fact that all of the submissions as part of the Stevens Initiative assessment were in English, which was a necessity for us because we didn't have the resources to be able to translate and still analyze all of the data, but obviously plays a huge role in the kind of data that you're going to get from students who are, working in a second or third language. So, so that is, definitely a limitation of the work that happened here. But the two that I kind of wanted to also look at and talk to you about a little bit is this limited number of responses, and I'll show you the numbers that we ended up with, and this time-consuming nature. I think those are the two, because we're talking specifically about EU and US funded initiatives, this is, I think, especially the time-consuming nature of it, becomes a big issue. When we were within the scope of this grant, we had, bespoke resources to be able to do this analysis and, to be able to do it in a very specific fashion. We had a discrete set of professors and students that we could administer the surveys to. We had a dedicated staff person at the COIL Center who was in charge of this project alone. And so she was able to really, in a very directive fashion, sort of administer and, anonymize and, all of the surveys as they went out to the students. She could track to see, which codes for students had responded and which ones hadn't. There was a lot of hands-on administration that happened from the COIL Center level. Outside of the scope of a grant project like this, what are we left with when the assessment information is so intensive? We no longer have those resources. We no longer have that staff member. We're a very small team at the COIL Center, and we have a network of 28 SUNY campuses and 40 plus international campuses, all kinds of virtual exchanges happening across those networks. It becomes very quickly not something that we can manage at this level of intensity. This is what we ended up with the data sets, and I just wanted to kind of show these numbers because this, especially for the third cohort, which was right up to the end of the grant period, so we were kind of left at the end with, this is the data that we have left. How are we going to analyze it now that we're outside the scope of the funded initiative, as I just mentioned? But statistically speaking, you can see the major issue that happens here, right? So we were asking far too much of these students to do a pre, mid, and post. So by the time they got to the post survey, they were done and they just didn't follow through. So and we could only really, to do any kind of across time analysis, we could only compare and really analyze the data for students who completed all three of the surveys, and that was a very small number in the end. So this was kind of a major issue for us. So we ended up doing a much lighter sort of thematic analysis of the Cohort 3 data. We enlisted a graduate student to do that analysis and write a final report, which I can also make available to you, but it's a much more scaled back kind of version. It's much more about the stories that were told and the general themes that came out of the activity, as opposed to kind of the much more detailed and in-depth analysis that happened with Cohort 2. So where does this kind of bring us in terms of COIL and virtual exchange assessment in general? These were, to go back again to the presentation that Sarah and I did here 2 years ago, these were kind of the implications that we saw at that time for assessment in general, that it had to be an integral part of the student's grade so that they would be motivated to complete it. Even then, it doesn't always happen, right? We all know that too. It could be better integrated into the design of the project, into the classroom activities, reflecting as things go along so that students felt more prepared, more inclined to answer the reflective prompts, things like that. And then offering the option of a reflective essay as opposed to the post-survey was another thing. But then, to use the guiding prompts, to ensure that they have at their disposal the answers that they provided for the first and second, the pre and mid responses, so that they could really analyze for themselves the change that they were seeing. And these were done through Google Forms, so they did receive their responses by email, but they invariably didn't look at them or lost them, couldn't find the email, weren't sure, all of those things. Their dogs ate their responses. So, in some cases, I think. So those were all kinds of some of the implications that we saw for COIL assessment. The broader questions that I think that are important for us to talk about here as well are kind of what we've learned through these funded initiatives, what does that tell us about the direction of research around virtual exchange and COIL kind of more broadly and in general. And this is something that the COIL Center is, kind of really trying to position ourselves for, because like I said, we're not a research institution. We are a pretty practical center. We do a lot of professional development for professors who want to do these kinds of projects, things like that. However, we've been in this field for a long time, kind of collectively, and we are seeing massive changes in the field of virtual exchange. It's growing very quickly right now. It's very popular, not just in the US, but everywhere around the world. There's a lot of interest in this methodology. So we want to, figure out how this field can get to a place where, in terms of research and assessment, we're talking about the same things, right? So we want to try and avoid some of the pitfalls that have happened in other fields that grow quickly and don't compare apples to apples all the time, right? So, so we have looked at we've actually pulled together research groups at a variety of conferences, the International Virtual Exchange Conference, previously was the COIL Conference that we held in New York each year, and now it's kind of expanded to reflect this larger community of practice that is growing. At a variety of things like EAIE in Europe, AIEA, we try to kind of put out a call to people who are interested in these research questions and do some sort of a research-based meeting to get people in the room and talking about these ideas and where it's headed. So basically, we're kind of looking at two threads of this research. First being this very concrete assessment sort of piece, the more short-term, immediate outcomes of what the impacts are of this kind of activity in classrooms, you know, around the world, how it impacts various elements, right? And the tools for those kinds of assessments, there are lots of them now. They abound. And they are of varying degrees of, you know, quality or usefulness or however you want to look at it, right? So I've just kind of picked apart the one that we used, so you can see that we obviously ran into lots of issues with it. There are lots of other ones, but nothing's really emerged yet as like kind of a leader, and it's not necessarily that one does. However, you know, we do kind of want to all be talking about some of the same things, so maybe we want some threads that are similar across different kinds of courses, right? But so the ACE Japan project is exploring options using the BEVI tool, which was specifically developed not at all for virtual exchange, so it's kind of, you know, needs quite a bit of an adaptation. The EU-funded projects are assessing in varieties of ways. Our colleagues at DePaul University have their own assessment tool that they have developed that is that they've been using for multiple semesters, so that they now have, you know, a great deal of data that they can kind of compare across time and across multiple semesters. East Carolina, likewise, they have been doing COIL work for a long time, and they have their own tool for assessment that they use in their courses. And then we also know, kind of anecdotally, that there's a lot of homegrown things that professors who do a COIL project are like, ooh, I should ask my students what they think about how this went, and they just kind of throw something together. So those questions, and, you know, it brings up a lot of, you know, concerns, really, you know, in some ways. Like Miriam said, in the interview process, you know that students sometimes know what they think you want to hear. And often when you look at some of the questions in these kinds of assessment tools and things like that, they're often very leading. They're asking students to tell them what we think we want to hear, right? So there are some issues that happen there. So this is kind of one of the areas that the COIL Center is kind of trying to gather researchers to have these broader conversations about really, you know, do we want to have kind of a body of questions that are available to all practitioners that can kind of be adapted for different contexts and different disciplines, things like that? And if that's the case, how also can we make the data that everyone is collecting shareable so that we can all see the broader impacts of this work, you know, across different systems and universities and contexts, with FERPA regulations, with GDPR, with IRB concerns, with all of those things on top of it. Finding a way to share data like this becomes a little bit complicated, but we're trying to kind of have those conversations. And then in the longer term context, we are kind of looking at, you know, the bigger research questions of how virtual exchange and COIL work can be used as a strategy for internationalizing the curriculum, how we can shape that research agenda in a much broader sense, how this work impacts not just the students, but also professors who are trained in the work, right? And then opportunities, we look a lot at opportunities for using virtual exchange for social change, right? Using COIL around the Sustainable Development Goals so that it's not just a content area exchange that happens for students, but so that it touches on some broader issues. And then borrowing a page from the Critical Internationalization Network, I have gone with questions in lieu of conclusions because I don't have any conclusions. And, you know, I think we all have lots of questions still about how this research is going to really come together and as the future of the field grows. So this is just kind of, you know, where my head went when I started kind of toying with all of this data and looking at some of these questions. So is a pre and post assessment really our best option? Is that the way that we should be going, the direction we should be going in? Or do we want to do more qualitative, reflective kinds of opportunities and things like that? Miriam mentioned the e-portfolios, a combination of things like e-portfolios, micro-credentialing, different kinds of things like that could be used to really sort of draw in broader data sets, more information, all of that kind of things, and then those kinds of things. And then, as I mentioned, you know, all of these kinds of questions about how we manage the volume of data that comes in, how we take all of these things that we're learning through these funded initiatives, which give us a very specific opportunity to experiment with these kinds of assessment tools, and then broaden that out. So that is pretty much it for me, and I am happy to share more information if.
Okay, we have about 4 minutes for questions. I see we have the first one over here.
Thank you, Jan. One of the questions I had is connected to the assessment you're doing on students. What kind of other parallel assessments are you doing in terms of the faculty?
Exactly. So we don't have a really strategic way that we do that. When we do our professional development with faculty members, we gather a lot of information anecdotally from them. And we used to send out surveys after every iteration, but we have not been doing that recently, and because they all need to be revamped in a variety of ways. So it's certainly on the list. But like I said, that's one of the big things that we want to see is what are the impacts of this kind of work on the professors who come to it, you know, and who are they, and you know, what fields are best represented and which ones are we missing still, and things like that. So it's definitely an area that is ripe for more research.
And along with that is within the SUNY system, is there any conversations, or are there any conversations going on about how this type of work with virtual exchange can be considered as part of one's tenure review portfolio?
Yes, that is a big question at the SUNY system, and it varies on each campus. So as I was telling someone earlier, that in spite of the fact that SUNY is a gigantic system, the campuses tend to operate fairly autonomously in a variety of ways. And so that is one of the things that, you know, campus by campus, it varies. It varies whether professors get incentivized in any way to do a COIL project. That happens on only a few campuses. And then the ability for them to use this towards tenure and promotion varies pretty widely. But it is absolutely something that we are working on. There's a large initiative happening at SUNY currently called the Global Learning for All Initiative, in which from the system level, there's a whole task force of folks from all of the campus sectors who are coming together to talk specifically about how we integrate global learning into the experience of every SUNY student, of which there are 500,000. So it's a huge initiative, and COIL is kind of taking a pretty significant role in that, because COIL and virtual exchange is seen as, you know, one of these ways to bridge that gap between the mobility students and the all, right? So we have to try and find ways to do that. So those questions of tenure and promotion and incentivization and scalability of these projects is absolutely on the table as part of this larger initiative.
Okay, we have time for maybe one last quick question, if anyone has one. Well, okay, let's thank our presenter again.
Thank you.